Today's video is proudly sponsored by Linode. Linode has been doing cloud computing since 2003, which is actually before Amazon Web Services was even a thing. On Linode's platform, you can get your server up and running in minutes, and they include all the popular distributions such as Debian, Fedora, Ubuntu, and get this, even Arch Linux. And let's be honest, what could be better than a Linux-focused cloud server provider that lets you tell all of your friends, I run Arch? Linode has multiple server plans available to make any app scalable and flexible. You could use it to host a blog, a VPN server, a Minecraft server, and much more. In fact, Linode is the platform of choice to host the entire web presence of LearnLinuxTV. In addition, Linode offers 24/7 365 support, regardless of plan size, so you can get help from a live person when you need it. New users can get started right now with $100 towards your new account, and I highly recommend you check them out because Linode is awesome. And now, let's get started with today's video. Hello again everyone, and welcome back to LearnLinuxTV. In today's video, we're going to take a look at user management in Linux, one of the most important things that you'll learn how to do because, well, you have to keep track of your users on your Linux servers, and that's exactly what I'm going to show you the basics of in this video. I'll show you how to add users, how to remove users, how to set their password, and some other stuff as well. So let's go ahead and get started. Alright, so here I am on my Pop! OS system. This is my ThinkPad X1 Extreme laptop, but it doesn't really matter which distribution you're using or what computer you have. There will be some variations here and there, but for the most part, when it comes to adding and removing users, it's the same on each distribution. Now, if I do run across something that I think might be different from one distro to another, I'll be sure to point it out. Let's go ahead and open up a terminal and get started. And here's my terminal, complete with a ridiculously large font. I just want to make sure that everyone is able to see the content and understand what I'm doing. Let's go ahead and get started. Just like with most things when it comes to Linux, there's more than one way that we can do just about everything, and adding users is no exception to that. Especially in my case, considering I'm using desktop Linux, I don't even need to use the command line at all. However, using the command line is completely universal. There's many different desktop environments, and each one is going to have a different process for adding users, but each Linux distribution is going to have access to the user add command, which is the command that we'll be using for the majority of this video. And when it comes to servers, it's very common that Linux servers won't have a desktop environment, another reason to learn the command line. Anyway, like I mentioned, the command that we will use to add a new user to our system is the user add command. And considering that we'll be making changes to the system, we'll either need to be logged in as root, or we can simply use sudo in order to run this command with root privileges, which is required for any command that's going to make changes to the server. And of course, adding a user is making a system-wide change, so of course we're going to need root privileges, or we could just use sudo if we have that installed, and most of you should. After we type user add, we type the name of the user that we actually want to add to the system, and that will complete the command. Before we actually add a new user, let's take a look at some foundational concepts first, before we get started on that. And the first thing that I recommend you do is understand which users you have on your system already. What some people do is they will simply list the contents of the home directory, because generally speaking, most users will have his or her own home directory underneath /home, and you can see mine right here. So I have a home directory, and we can glean from this that my user J is on the system. Now, you probably already knew that because, well, you can see my username right here in the prompt. So you already knew that at least my user account existed here, and here it is. But checking the contents of the home directory is not really the best way to find out how many users or which users in particular you have already on your server. I mean, from the output here, you'd probably assume that my user account is the only user on the system. But actually, that's not true. What I want to do right now is make sure that you're aware of the existence of a very special file. And that's the etc password file. Password is abbreviated. That's not a typo. That's actually what the file is named. But I'll refer to it as etc password, which is common in the Linux community, even though it's abbreviated. So the cat command is just going to show me the contents of that file. And you can see that the text is wrapped here. So what I'm going to do is just lower the font size a bit. And as you can see, we have quite a few users on this system, not just mine, we have many more. You see my user right here. And each user is on their own line. So for example, if I was to again cat the contents of the etc password file, and then I pipe it into the wc command, which stands for word count, and that's a bonus command. It wasn't even supposed to be part of the video, but you're welcome. Anyway, what I'm going to do is add the -l option to the word count command. And what that's going to do is give me the count of how many lines there are. So as you can see from the output, there's 44 users on this system. So definitely a lot more than the one you saw earlier when I listed the contents of /home. And in this file, every user on the system has its own line in this file. The first column shows the name of the user, and then there's other columns that follow after that. I'll go over this file in a little bit more detail later on, but at this point in the video, I want to make sure that you're aware of this file, that you're aware that it exists, and that you're aware of what its purpose is. Its purpose is to contain a listing and the options that are associated with the user accounts on your server. But either way, it's just a good idea to know whether or not the user is on the system already, and by checking the contents of this file, we can determine that. Now, one of the things I'm going to do is cat this out again, but I'm going to grep, so that way the only line of output that it's going to produce is just the one line that contains my user account. And what I want to point you to is this number right here, where it shows 1000. Now again, I'll go over this file in more detail later, but I think it's a good idea to understand what this number is. That number refers to the user ID, aka UID. Every user has his or her own UID. As you can see here, the UID of my user is 1000. Most distributions of Linux actually ask you to create a user account during the installation process, and that first user is, well, pretty much almost always given the UID of 1000. I'll talk more about UIDs a bit later, but that's just another thing that I wanted you to be aware of. Anyway, let's go back to the user add command. After all, that's why we're here in the first place. We want to know how to add and remove users. And the user add command, as the name would imply, is the command that we would use to add a user to the system. I'm logged in as Jay, so I can't really use this command like I mentioned earlier without sudo or just logging in as root. So I'm going to add sudo to the command. And then at the end, I'm going to give it the name of a user I want to create. So I'm going to tell it to create a user with the name of Fox Mulder. So for all of you X-Files fans out there, yes, that was an Easter egg. And the X-Files was actually my favorite sci-fi series growing up. I loved watching that every Sunday night. Great times. Anyway, what I'm going to do right now is press enter. And now it's asking me for my password, my user password, to verify that I have access to the sudo command. And it didn't say anything, but it also doesn't appear to have failed either. So if I cat the contents of etc password again, let's see what happens. And as you can see, the very last line in this file shows that user was created. Now, if you recall, the UID for my user was UID 1000. For Fox Mulder, that user got UID 1001. Now, something to keep in mind is that when you add a user to a Linux system, it's going to assign the next available UID to that user. Now, my user already had assigned the UID of 1000, so that UID is no longer available. When I created the account Fox Mulder, it just incremented it by 1001. That's the UID that it was provided, as you can see here. Now, you'll notice from the output that there's some UIDs here that are much lower than 1000. For example, 122, 121, and so on. On most distributions of Linux, normal user accounts, basically user accounts that are associated with interactive logins, or basically user IDs that are going to be used by a human, those are given UIDs 1000 and above. UIDs below 1000 are considered system accounts. And I'll talk a little bit more about system accounts in a few minutes, but I just wanted you to be aware of that distinction. We have user accounts. We also have system user accounts. And the user add command, by default, adds normal user accounts. Now, I added a user for Fox Mulder. We did that with the previous command that we entered. Let's also list the contents of the home directory and see whether or not that user has a home directory underneath /home. And it doesn't. Why is that? Now, depending on your distribution, it might have actually created a home directory for that user. On my end, it didn't. This is one thing that actually does differ from one distribution to another. Each distribution is going to set their own defaults for the user add command. So on your end, it might have created a home directory. On my end, well, I wasn't so fortunate. So let's take a quick detour here. And what I'm going to do is point you to another file. And that file is the etc default user add file. Now, I'm not going to go over this particular file in too much detail, but basically what it does is sets the defaults for user add. Each distribution is free to supply their own version of this particular file. So as you can see here, we have shell equals /bin/sh. If you want to use a different default shell, then you'll change it right here. But basically this file just sets the defaults. And again, it's going to be different from one distribution to another. And it's entirely possible that on your distribution, you may not even have this file at all. Now, all I want at this point is for you to be aware that this file exists. What you might think that I'm going to recommend is that you customize this file with the defaults that you prefer. But I'm not going to do that. Instead, I recommend that you be explicit. Say what you mean and mean what you say. So even if your distribution did create a home directory here, I still recommend that you tell the user add command specifically that you want a home directory. Now on your end, that might be redundant. If it already created a home directory for the user that you created, then why should you bother and add a redundant option to tell it to create a home directory when it already did? Now, it's a good idea to basically be explicit when it comes to Linux. Include all the options. And that's especially true when you're writing scripts, because you want your scripts to be portable. Maybe you have a script that you want to run on multiple distributions. If that's the case, you'll probably want the same output every time that script runs. So if you are using the user add command as part of a script, you'll probably want to add all the appropriate options to ensure that all the user accounts that you create are always created the same way. And I recommend that you be explicit not just when you're creating scripts, but basically just get in the habit of always doing that. So what I want to do is re-add the user, but I want to add the user with a home directory this time. But that requires another detour because the user already exists. I could create another user, but what I'm going to do instead is take this opportunity to show you how to remove a user account. So to remove a user account, you can use the user del command, the user delete command, however you want to say it. We'll need to use sudo, and then we give it the name of the user that we want to delete. But be very careful here. When you run a command like this on a Linux system, the Linux system is going to make the assumption that you know what you're doing. So just make sure that you're typing the username that's actually the user you want to delete. Just be very careful. So we created a user earlier named Fox Mulder. I'm going to delete that user account. Maybe Mulder got abducted by aliens or something. I don't know, but we're going to remove him from the system. And that's it. Now that user didn't even have a home directory to begin with. But the thing is though, if that user did have a home directory, they would probably still have a home directory here because of the user delete command that doesn't delete the home directory for the user when you delete a user by default. Just keep that in mind. We'll return to that in a few minutes. But anyway, we can see here that that particular user account is gone. So let's go ahead and add that user back to the system, and at the same time, make sure that a home directory is also created for that user when we create the user itself. And this is the command right here that we used earlier. So what I'm going to do is add the -m option. I'll press enter. No output, just like last time. But the difference, at least in my case, is that the user actually has a home directory right now. We see that right here. the line is wrapped a bit. You get the idea. That user does indeed have a home directory. We added the -m option, which is what you see here, that specifically tells UserAdd that we want a home directory when we create this user. So let's talk about removing the user again, but this time also removing the home directory as well. And again, we see that user does indeed have a home directory. And earlier, when we removed this account the first time, this is the command that we used right here. So to remove a home directory, we add the -r option to this command. That's going to, like I mentioned, remove the user account and also their home directory. Now, before I actually press enter here, I do want to mention that before you start removing a home directory for a user, for example, if you are working at a company, you'll want to make sure that you should remove their home directory before you actually do it. For example, if an employee leaves the company, that employee's supervisor might need access to their files in order to finish any projects that they might have been working on. But if you delete their files, well, they can't do that. Perhaps more importantly, a lot of companies out there, they have requirements for how long to retain their employees' data. And if you're actually working in a company, it's extremely important that you ask HR or whoever it is you ask there what the retention policy is for employee data. You'll want to make sure that you are in compliance with any policies that might exist. Maybe a company might have a policy where they have to retain user records for a few years. And if you delete a user account with their home directory, then you are not in compliance. Now, if your company does not have a policy when it comes to user data retention or data retention in general, it's actually one of those things that should definitely be drafted. Let somebody know. Anyway, I'm going to press enter. We can ignore this message right here about the mail spool. That's beyond the scope of this video. That is a normal message though, so nothing to be concerned with. And we could check the contents of the home directory again, and that home directory is in fact gone. Another thing that I want to show you guys is how to set a password for a user, because when we added the Foxmolder user, it didn't even ask us what we wanted the password to be for that user. In fact, the user had no password at all. Now what I'm going to do is just add the user back to the system. I'm going to add it with the home directory. So nothing different. I'll just press enter. User has a home directory and the user is on the system. So let's take a look at how we set a password for the user. And to set a password for a user, or even change our own password for that matter, we have a dedicated command, the passwd command. Now, if I entered this by itself right now, it's going to assume that I want to change the password for the user that I'm currently logged in with. So if you had a user, for example, that came to you and said, how do I change my password? You would ask them to run the passwd command. You don't even need to get involved. They can change their own password. There's nothing for you as the administrator to do in this regard, other than to know that the passwd command exists. And I'm going to actually use it right now. I'm going to make it fail on purpose though. And the reason why is because I don't want to change my password right now. But the first thing that it does is it asks you for your current password, which I've entered. And then it asks you for your new password. What do you want your new password to be? Which I've entered. And then you enter it again. And it's telling me that the passwords don't match, and that was intentional. If the passwords did match, then the password I chose right then and there would become my password. So that's how you change the password for the user that you're logged in with. But actually, I brought that up in regards to setting a password for another user. So for example, if you have someone that's going to start logging into your Linux server, you could set a temporary password for them and then ask them to change it. In a future video, we'll be going over password expiration, but we're going to omit that right now just to keep things simple. So to change a password for another user, you can type sudo, because in order to change a password for another user, you do need root privileges or at least access to sudo in order to be able to do that. Then you can run passwd, and then the name of the user that you want to change the password for, or in this case, you want to set the password. So I'll type the name of the user right here. Now notice that it didn't ask me for the user's current password. You might think that the reason why it didn't ask me was because the user didn't even have a password. We didn't even set a password. But if you have access to sudo or the root user, it's never going to ask you for the user's current password. I mean, root is pretty much like God mode, if you've ever played Doom, for example. It's the all-powerful account that can do basically everything. So root doesn't need to know the password of the user to change or set the password. So even if the user already had a password, it doesn't care. You're setting the password, and anyone that has access to root has permission to set a password for another user. So I'm going to type it in right now. And again. And it said password updated successfully. So I was able to add a password for the Fox Mulder user. Now let's go ahead and see an example of creating a system user. A system user is very useful when you are doing any kind of automation. For example, maybe you have an accounting department and you need to run a financial report for them every week. That sounds tedious to me, and to be honest with you, doing a financial report, that doesn't really excite me. And if you're like me, you'll probably want to automate that report, so you'll never be bothered to do it. But if you're going to automate something like a process or some sort of task, then it makes sense to not use your user account for it. Create a system user. And actually, you can use a system user with cron to run a scheduled job, which is the best way to do it. Now, I'll be covering cron in a future video in this series. Go ahead and check the playlist to see if it's already there. But for now, just keep in mind that system users are useful when you want something to run in the background, and it's not something that's associated to any one person. So let's go ahead and add a system user right now. So again, it's sudo and then user add. And we're going to use -r. And that -r option actually allows us to designate that we want to create a system user specifically, not a normal user. And what I'm going to do is call the system user sysuser. Just like that. I'll press enter. And what I'm going to do is cat the contents of etc password again. And I'm going to grep for sysuser because I only want to see that one line. And we see it right here. Now notice that the UID is 998. It doesn't start with 1000. Earlier, when we created a user, that user was assigned UID 1001. But this user was actually assigned a UID of less than 1000. And that's generally the case. Normal user accounts will be provided a UID of 1000 or greater. And then system users will generally be provided a UID of less than 1000. And that distinction doesn't really matter so much, other than you can deduce that a user is most likely a system user based on the UID. In my case, I'm using a desktop distribution of Linux, and most of the time, desktop distributions will not show a system user on the login screen. Now that does vary from one distribution to another, but generally speaking, most distributions will not show UIDs on the login screen that are under 1000. And that's important because if it did show UIDs that are under 1000, then in my case, there would be probably around 44 user accounts shown on the login screen, and that's very messy. But anyway, at this point, I just want you to be aware of the -r option, and just keep in mind that that allows you to create a system user. And a system user, again, is a user that generally doesn't log in interactively and is used for things that are going to run in the background, schedule tasks, processes, things like that. Now, that actually completes the main part of this video. The whole goal was to show you the basics of user management, and I've already showed you how to add a user, how to remove a user, and some options with the user add command. Now, of course, you could just type man and then user add, and then you get a bunch of options here as far as some of the additional things that you can do with that command. But as far as the basics are concerned, which was the actual purpose of this entire video, we're covered there. But I'm not going to end the video just yet. There's one more thing that I want to show you guys. And as I promised earlier in the video, I told you that I would go over the contents of the etc password file to help you guys understand it better. Let's go ahead and do that right now. Now, as you recall, the etc password file, that contains a listing of all the users on the system. There's quite a few lines there. So what I'm going to do is lower the font size a bit, just to make sure you can see everything. Hopefully that's not too small. We have several different columns on each line, and each column is separated by a colon. Now the first column is the username. No surprise there. The second column, which is this one right here, that just refers to the password. Actually, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but it essentially means that we have an encrypted password in use here. And nowadays, we don't really use any other kind of password. We always use hashed passwords, which is what this refers to. It just means that the password for this user is hashed. It's not shown here. In some ways, that's a carryover from the olden days, which is why I'm not going to go into too much detail on that. But you'll probably almost, if not always, see an X in that field. Continuing, we have the UID right here, as I talked about earlier. The next field is the group ID. I've already explained what a UID is earlier in the video, and a GID or group ID is essentially the same thing, but for groups. I'll be covering groups in a separate video, so don't worry about that right now. This field here, that is the user information field, and you might see that referred to as the geckos field, G-E-C-O-S, so it looks like that. But I like to refer to it as the user information field, and it's most commonly used for the first and last name, as you see here. That user information field is completely optional. It's perfectly fine to go ahead and skip it, and you'll actually see it skipped in other user accounts and other lines. You'll see like 2 colons together. That just means that that information isn't there. It's blank. Continuing on, we have the home directory for the user, in my case, /home/j. That's where my home directory is. So it's essentially telling the Linux system where to find the home directory for that user. The last column here, that refers to the shell that is designated for that user. When a user logs in, their shell is activated. In my case, /bin/bash. That's the shell that I'm going to be using when I log in. So for example, if I type echo, then $, and then shell in all caps, you can see that my shell is /bin/bash. And that was set right here. And again, this is the shell that's going to start up as soon as I log in. Now you will see other things here instead of /bin/sh or bin bash. For example, user sbin no login. And you'll see other variations of this as well. User sbin no login means, well, that user's not going to be able to log in. And when it comes to system users, we really don't want them to log in. And generally speaking, system users are not associated to a human being, so there's no reason for them to interactively log in. And they don't have to log in order to run reports, run commands, scripts, or anything like that. Often people will use system accounts to automate things, like I mentioned earlier, and that's essentially all this is. User sbin no login means basically what it says. When that user tries to log in, even if you did set a password for that user, they'll be denied. It's going to attempt to run user sbin no login, which is basically going to deny the login. Now let's go ahead and take a look at the etc shadow file. Now real quick, you'll recall that I mentioned that we have an X right here for most, if not all, the users, and that X refers to the fact that that user has a hashed password. It's almost always going to be the case. We really don't want to store the user's password in plain text in the etc password file. We would rather hash it and store it somewhere else. So if we take a look at the etc shadow file, now, as an aside, you will need sudo in order to view this file, unlike the etc password file. As you can see, I was able to run cat etc password with no sudo at all, but I can't get away with that when it comes to etc shadow, so I will add sudo. Now, just like with the etc password file, with the etc shadow file, we have a bunch of different columns on each line, and each column is separated by a single colon. On the left, we have the username. And that's the username right here. And to make it a little bit easier, I'm going to grep for my user account here, just to get it down to one line. Makes it a little bit easier. But in the first column, again, we have the username. In the second column, which is actually ridiculously long, we have the actual hash for the password. Now this isn't my actual password, it's just a hash of my password. That's an important distinction. So moving on, we have this field right here, and that number refers to the number of days since the Unix epoch that the password was last changed. For those that aren't already aware, the Unix epoch is January 1st of 1970. Therefore, we can read that column as the password having last been changed that many days after the Unix epoch. So in this case, 18,807 days. The fourth column tells us how many days are required to pass before the user will be able to change their password again. In this example, the user can change their password, well, anytime. And they can do that because the number of days is set to 0. 0 means anytime. This column right here refers to how many days until a password change is required. In this case, 99,999 days since the Unix epoch will pass until I'm required to change my password. So I guess it may as well be infinite. In a future video, we'll explore user password expiration, so don't worry about that too much right now. So here we have number 7, and this field refers to how many days until the user will be reminded to change their password. So in this case, if the user's password is going to expire within 7 days, it's going to show them a message on the shell. But, well, there's quite a few days until this password is going to expire, so even though it shows 7, I'm probably never going to see that message. Now here we have several columns that are not set at all. So the next field would have showed us how many days until the user password is going to be locked. I never actually set a time for the password to be locked, so that's not set. We also have a field that would normally show us how many days until the account is disabled, but that's not set either. Now I went over the last fields here fairly quickly, and that's because you really don't need to memorize that. You can if you want to, but we have a dedicated command that we would use to lock a user account, to set a password expiration and things like that, and more importantly, a dedicated command we can use to check that information without having to remember those fields. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. We'll get to that when we cover password expiration in a future video. So there you go. There's actually additional concepts that we could have gone over in this video when it comes to user management, but I decided to save those for future videos. Again, check the playlist for this series because other videos on user management might already exist, and if they don't, I will create those for you very soon. Make sure you subscribe so you'll be the first to see those videos as soon as they're out. Regardless, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I'll see you next time.